Joe's Stupid Video Productions continues its tradition of telling stories that no one cares about and presenting them in crap videos. Several months ago, I completed a video project that documented my father's experiences as a Navy pilot in World War II. Much of the content for that documentary was extracted from combat footage found on YouTube. I was a Marine Corps navigator during the Vietnam War, and while viewing videos from World War II, my curiosity caused me to search for Vietnam War footage. Most of the YouTube videos from the Vietnam War came from documentaries containing combat footage filmed by the military. I witnessed some of the events caught on camera, and many memories resurfaced. With nothing better to do, I decided that Joe's Stupid Video Productions needed another project to continue its tradition of telling stories no one cares about and presenting them in crap videos. I joined the Marine Corps in 1966 with the intention of going to flight school and becoming a pilot, but the Marine Corps had different plans for me. They were desperate for navigators. All transoceanic flights required a navigator. Prior to the Vietnam War, the Marine Corps only had a couple of dozen navigators and didn't have much need for them because they didn't have many transoceanic flights. In 1962, the Marine Corps began taking delivery of KC-130 Hercules aircraft, a 4-engine turboprop that could be used for a variety of purposes. When the Vietnam War started to heat up in 1965, they needed navigators. They could only train a limited number of navigators in a year. Training took almost 6 months and involved 1,000 hours of classroom time, 50 hours of time in a planetarium, and 50 hours of flight training. When I graduated from Nav School in March 1967, there were 30 to 40 navigators spread across 3 squadrons containing a total of 36 KC-130 aircraft. I joined a squadron based in Southern California and immediately began flying. I spent the next 31 months flying to, from, and around Vietnam. My last flight into Vietnam was in November 1969. From my perspective, there were 2 chapters to the story of my time in the Marine Corps: the Tet Offensive and everything else. In December 1967, after spending 9 months flying in and out of Southern California, I transferred to a squadron with bases in Da Nang, Vietnam, and Okinawa. I spent the next 13 months flying in and around Vietnam and Southeast Asia. I returned to Southern California in March 1969 and continued flying across the Pacific and in and around Vietnam. Duty as a navigator was somewhat unique for the Marine Corps. Because we were few in number, we spent most of our time flying. When we weren't flying, we had very little else to do. When I wasn't flying, I was either in the nav office playing cards or the gym playing basketball. I rarely wore a uniform. I loved navigating. When flying over water, I was my own boss. The navigator was always busy when flying. Each flight had its own unique problems and challenges requiring creative solutions. The pilot would tell the navigator the destination and takeoff time. Prior to takeoff, the navigator did the route selection, weather assessment, and flight planning. While in flight, the navigator figured out where the plane was, gave the required position reporting data to the radio operator to pass on to ground control, and gave the pilot all the heading changes. This routine continued until the airplane got about 150 miles from the destination, at which time the pilot and ground control could take over. During the 30 months I was assigned to a squadron, I spent 60 to 70% of my time in a flight suit flying back and forth across the Pacific and in and around Vietnam. I logged over 3,500 hours of flight time, made 40 trips across the Pacific, flew through 4 typhoons, flew back and forth from Okinawa to Vietnam 70 times, spent 140 nights in Vietnam, and flew over 300 combat missions, and was awarded 15 air medals. Most of the footage in this video was extracted from YouTube. In doing so, I'm reasonably certain I haven't violated any copyright laws. I used Google's newly introduced artificial intelligence model called BARD to create a historical summary of the Vietnam War and the Tet Offensive. This gave me a context in which I inserted my own observations and stories.
KheSahn, an Allied base manned by U.S. Marines and 1 battalion of South Vietnamese Rangers. Cornerstone of the defense line where the demilitarized zone and the Laotian border meet. The mountains surrounding KheSahn overlook the Ho Chi Minh Trail. To Giap and to some Western observers, KheSahn's similarity to Dien Bien Phu make it a lucrative target, one that might bring a victory as decisive as the one that forced the French withdrawal a decade before. Into the area, Giap moves 2 full divisions, more than 20,000 men, and positions them to surround the 6,000 defenders. A 3rd division is moved toward the Marine base at Camp Carroll. Routes blocked. Every ounce of food, every round of ammunition must be flown in to the besieged Marines across an air bridge that is always busy, always dangerous. The big cargo aircraft become known as mortar magnets, but in spite of the mortars, in spite of enemy anti-aircraft fire, in spite of bad weather, the air bridge is never cut. On the airstrip, the airlift planes meet increasing enemy fire.
Against everything you can think of was thrown at the aircraft. I mean, there were small arms. There was a weapon similar to our .50 caliber that the North Vietnamese kept on putting on the end of the runway and would shoot at the aircraft as they came down final approach.
Miraculously, shelling destroys only one C-130. That plane burns beyond repair and then remains on the base as a reminder of the constant danger.
The majority of the damage that we took was from 51 caliber and below. That was in the air. The majority of the damage on the ground when we landed was taken from 133 millimeter artillery, rockets, mortars, just about everything hit us.
The intensifying barrage forces the planes to deliver the goods by parachute. Armed with the latest target information, the ABCCs direct the forward air controllers, who in turn direct the fighter bombers to enemy positions within yards of the Marines' perimeter. In March, about the time of the 14th anniversary of his victory at Dien Bien Phu, Giap orders the withdrawal of the first of 2 divisions, which are then in the process of being destroyed. The Marines move out in pursuit of the enemy. Now the extent of the communist defeat becomes more apparent. The debris left on the battlefield is mute testimony. Stockpiles of ammunition, rockets, mortars, and automatic weapons, laboriously packed down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, are abandoned. Captured North Vietnamese troops provide added facts. One regiment is reported to have lost 75% of its 2,000 men. Mass desertions to escape the bombing are not uncommon. Giap's soldiers were existing on starvation rations. Total enemy losses are estimated at 15,000 men. The long siege is over.
Of navigation school in February 1967, I spent the next 31 months flying to, from, and around Vietnam. My last flight into Vietnam was in November 1969. From my perspective, the Vietnam War had 2 distinctly different chapters, the Tet Offensive and everything else. I'm recording this in July 2023. At that time, Google's AI model called BARD had this to say about the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War was a long and complex conflict. There were several significant milestones and events, but the most important ones were: the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred in 1964. This incident, in which North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, led to the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to wage war in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive occurred in 1968. This surprise attack by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces on South Vietnamese cities and towns was a major turning point in the war. It showed that the United States was not winning the war, and it led to a decline in public support for the war in the United States. The Paris Peace Accords occurred in 1973. These accords ended direct U.S. involvement in the war, but they did not end the war itself. South Vietnam fell to the North Vietnamese in 1975. The war was a long and bloody conflict, and it had a profound impact on the people of Vietnam, the United States, and the world.
Tet was more like a traditional war between two armies with fighting both day and night. Tet lasted about 6 months during 1968. The rest of the time before and after 1968 was more of a guerrilla war. The VC owned the night, but would go back to work during the day, indistinguishable from every other Vietnamese. Your Vietnamese barber cutting your hair during the day might be shooting you at night. Tet was intense. Google's Bard had this to say about the Tet Offensive.
The Tet Offensive was a series of surprise attacks launched by the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong on January 30, 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year called Tet. The offensive was a major turning point in the Vietnam War, and it had a number of significant milestones or events, including the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. This was one of the most symbolic attacks of the Tet Offensive, and it showed that the NVA and VC were capable of striking even the most heavily defended targets in South Vietnam. The recapture of Hue. The city of Hue was one of the most important strategic objectives of the Tet Offensive, and it took the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces over a month to recapture it. The Battle of KheSahn. This was a major battle that took place in the KheSahn combat base in South Vietnam. The base was besieged by the NVA for over a month, but it was eventually relieved by U.S. forces.
Flight crews would spend 5 days in Vietnam and then rotate to Okinawa for a day or two before rotating back to Vietnam for another 5-day detachment. I was on this rotation for 13 months between January 1968 and February 1969. During each rotation, we flew 3 types of missions: flare drops, refueling missions, and cargo hauling. Flare drops. The VC owned the night. Many small land bases were attacked at night under the cover of darkness. We would take off shortly before dark and circle around the area at 5,000 feet or so, waiting for any calls from camps that came under attack. It was the navigator's job to maintain radio contact with the ground unit and to assist the pilot in staying on the correct location for the flare drop. Each flare drop would light up the sky for 4 to 5 minutes, so we'd fly in a racetrack pattern that would put us back over the target every 4 to 5 minutes. Most of the time, the pilot could keep the drop zone in sight without help from the navigator, but when it was overcast, the navigator had to assist. We'd normally keep dropping flares until the VC assault was over. Sometimes the battles would last all night. Many a time, the ground radio operator admitted to me that our flares saved their lives. On one occasion, the operator had to put down his radio and join the fight. His compound was being overrun. A while later, he got back to me. Our flares and support from Puff the Magic Dragon, a powerful gunship, had saved them from being overrun. Refueling missions. On occasion, we'd spend half a day doing a milk run and half a day flying on station to refuel fighters that still had ordnance but were running short of fuel. The navigator didn't have much work to do, so we'd be reading books or listening to the radio. These were usually uneventful, although on one occasion I saw a surface-to-air missile called a SAM chase one of our fighters. The fighter ran like a rabbit to avoid being hit. The SAM missed the fighter and hit a mountainside. Most of our refueling missions took place off of the coast of South Vietnam, but there was a period of time during which we'd fly up to the coast of North Vietnam and be available to refuel fighter bombers making runs on Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor. I only did this one time. We didn't refuel anyone, but I was able to watch Russian MiGs on radar. They were no further than 50 miles from us. We were well protected by our fighters and aircraft carriers, so the risk of being attacked was minimal. In May of 1969, after I had deployed back to the United States, we lost an airplane in a mid-air collision in Vietnam. All of the crew was killed, including Bob Bonebright, who was a nav school classmate and friend of mine. Cargo hauling missions were called milk runs. Most of our flying was delivering troops and supplies to combat airstrips, including KheSahn, Hue Phu Bai, Dong Ha, Chu Lai, and Quang Tri. During these milk runs, I logged over 300 landings and takeoffs in combat strips. I was one of 10 Marine Corps navigators that was flying in Vietnam during the entire Tet Offensive. You always expected to be shot at during these milk runs. With exception of KheSahn, we generally were only exposed to small arms fire from AK-47s. KC-130s were beasts and could withstand all of the small arms fire the VC could deliver. Most of the time we did not even know we were being fired upon unless ground control told us or the ground crew found a bunch of bullet holes when we returned to base. Worst case was we might land with a flat tire. I had one landing in which our tires were shot out. We spent several hours on the ground waiting for tires to be flown in by helicopter. During our time on the ground, we witnessed a short firefight between Marines protecting the airstrip and the VC in the village adjacent to the strip. KheSahn was different. KheSahn was intense. We experienced anti-aircraft fire on approach and mortar and artillery fire on the ground and while taking off. We knew we could spend no more than 2 minutes on the ground or we would be hit and destroyed. I don't know how many times I flew in and out of KheSahn during the siege, which lasted 77 days, but several things stick out in my mind. At the beginning of the siege, we didn't know the NVA had anti-aircraft guns. On one day, we were circling KheSahn at 3,000 feet or so, waiting for an opportunity to land, when all of a sudden, we felt turbulence normally associated with thunderclouds, but there were no clouds in the sky. I was standing behind the pilot looking out the front window when I saw black dots whizzing around us. I immediately said to the pilot, "Climb, you son of a bitch, we're being shot at." At the same time, the loadmaster entered the cockpit saying he could see airbursts out of the side windows. The pilot immediately pulled back on the yoke and we flew back to Da Nang to give fighter jockeys a chance to bomb the hell out of the enemy positions. After that, we always came in very low to make it hard for gunners to get a bead on us. When landing at KheSahn, it took the NVA a minute or so to zero in on us because they were always firing from new positions. They had to move their guns a lot to avoid our fighters and gunships. They always fired at us when we landed, but never managed a direct hit. My job at KheSahn was to help the loadmaster get the cargo off of the plane. The cargo was palletized and on a series of rollers hooked together. We would push off the pallets while taxiing at 10 miles an hour or so. The pallets were always very heavy, weighing 1,000 pounds or more. On one occasion, the rollers separated and part of the pallet got stuck in between them. The tool that was used to lift the pallet when this happened broke while we were using it. We thought we were screwed. The plane could not take off with the cargo stuck. To my amazement, the loadmaster and I lifted the pallet, slid the rollers together, and rolled the cargo off. I immediately raced to the cockpit for takeoff. It seemed like we had been on the ground for an eternity, but the whole escapade took less than 2 minutes, and as a result, the NVA didn't get a chance to zero in on us. There were times when we could not land at KheSahn, so we had to parachute pallets of food and ammo. We'd fly very low, 500 feet or so, and drop the cargo. The Marine Corps only did this a handful of times. The Air Force did most of it. I was on a drop when one of our chutes didn't open, sending the pallet crashing into one of the barracks. When we returned to Da Nang, we found out that no one was injured, but the hooch was destroyed. I didn't know it at the time, but my Uncle Jack, an Air Force pilot, was at KheSahn flying the scout aircraft that spotted for our artillery and fighter aircraft. I visited Jack in Southern California when we were both stateside. One of the first things he said to me was, "You damn Marines almost killed me." He went on to explain he was walking back to his hooch after taking a shower when he watched a pallet of cargo crash into his hooch, completely destroying it. Had it been a minute later, he would have been in the hooch and most certainly killed. I'm certain the pallet that almost killed Jack was the one we dropped. The most memorable event for me occurred on February 10th, 1968, shortly after my roommate Stan Rank and I arrived in Okinawa and began a rotation between Da Nang, Vietnam and Okinawa. Stan's aircraft was carrying fuel bladders and was hit by enemy fire on final approach. The aircraft crashed and burned. All 6 of the passengers and 3 of the 6 crew members died in the fire. Stan and 2 pilots escaped. The pilots exited through the front windows of the aircraft and were not severely injured. Stan exited through the cockpit door and was severely burned. He spent a year in the burn center at San Antonio, Texas, but amazingly returned to flying and finished out his enlistment. Had it not been for a coin flip, I could have been the one on the plane. The coin flip. When Stan and I arrived in Okinawa, one of us was to take off the next day and the other would take off 2 days later. Stan wanted to go the next day. That started a rotation that resulted in Stan flying to KheSahn February 10th instead of me. What a difference a day makes.
That's all, folks.